Dr. Nathan Bryan, welcome back to the podcast. We have you here today to talk about the holy grail of health, nitric oxide, and the miracle molecule, as you like to call it. Yeah. And specifically, we're going to start off today's episode by tier ranking the root causes of visceral fat, inflammation, and disease relating to poor nitric oxide production. Are you game for that?
Let's do it.
Okay, so we're going to start off with a big one that my audience has questions on, which is alcohol. What's the relationship between alcohol and nitric oxide, and where does it fall on our tier ranking system?
Well, I think it's certainly moderate alcohol consumption has some cytoprotective, cardioprotective properties. And so what happens is when you have moderate alcohol consumption, and we're talking maybe 1 or 2 drinks every couple of days, right? What that does is it's called alcohol or ethanol preconditioning. And this has been studied for 30 or 40 years. And the observation was that people who drink moderate alcohol, if they have a heart attack, the heart is a little bit protected from injury from someone who hasn't consumed alcohol. It's ethanol preconditioning. So it's upregulating an enzyme called aldehyde dehydrogenase, which is an enzyme that's responsible for metabolizing and prolonging nitric oxide activity. So there's a clear connection. However, the problem with overdoing alcohol consumption, you get portal hypertension, you get liver disease, and it destroys nitric oxide production, leads to inflammation, oxidative stress, and immune dysfunction. So I think what we're finding is, and then the other thing people ask me all the time too, what about drinking alcohol and affecting the oral microbiome? Because we know alcohol-based mouthwash kill it. But I tell people, at least when I drink a scotch, I'm not holding in my mouth for 30 or 60 seconds and swishing it around, right? So the alcohol in spirits, in wine, doesn't have a resident time long enough in the oral cavity to disrupt the microbiome.
So if you had to give alcohol a grade as it's related to not just nitric oxide, but the whole conversation of visceral fat, inflammation, and again, to contextualize it, you're talking about a moderate light level of drinking, right? Where would you put it on our ranking here? All right. We have S is supreme. That means like something is really actually genuinely great for you. And then we have the classic grades, A, B, C, D, F. Where are we going to put alcohol on this tier rank system?
I think if we're talking about moderate consumption and not overconsumption, again, and this is not my opinion, it's based on published science. But I think it's somewhere in the middle. It's probably a D. I'll give it a D.
Kind of right in the middle. D.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's not extremely beneficial. I mean, there are other ways that lead to cytoprotection, cardioprotection that are probably more health promoting than alcohol consumption. But it's certainly not an F.
Okay, we're going to come back to alcohol. I have a few more questions about alcohol, and I want to talk to you a little bit about why I chose to stop drinking. But we have a few other things to cover. Before we get into it, just give us a little reminder. You have a new book out. And we've had you on the podcast before to talk about this, but your new book is called The Secret of Nitric Oxide. Remind our audience why nitric oxide is truly one of the holy grails when it comes to our health.
Well, we've learned over the past 40 years in this entire science of nitric oxide, over 200,000 scientific papers published in the scientific and medical literature. So nitric oxide controls important things like blood pressure, sexual function, cognitive function. It controls inflammation, oxidative stress, and immune dysfunction, the hallmarks of chronic disease. It's involved in insulin signaling and glucose uptake. So we know today that the functional loss of nitric oxide inside the human body is the earliest event in the onset progression of most, I think probably all, age-related chronic disease. So if you're doing things that are disrupting nitric oxide production, that sets the stage for rapid acceleration, onset, and progression of chronic disease. If we can maintain optimal nitric oxide production, both the basic science and the clinical science tells us that we can prevent or delay onset of age-related disease, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, vascular dementia, Alzheimer's. Everything we know about chronic disease revolves around poor blood flow, inflammation, oxidative stress, and immune dysfunction. And nitric oxide corrects all 4.
Incredible. All right, we have a few more to go, and we're going to come back to nitric oxide. So let's talk about smoking. In this day and age, still, there's a lot of people that are out there that are smoking, and they don't think it's that bad for them. When it comes to the conversation of poor nitric oxide, inflammation, visceral fat, where would you tier rank smoking on our list over here?
Smoking, with all the data, all the warning signs, even on the cigarette packages themselves, yet people still smoke. And I get it. It's an addiction, right? They know it's bad for them, but they get pleasure out of it. But smoking is absolute at the bottom. It's probably the worst thing you could do. Interestingly, though, cigarette smoke, people who are smoking, we can detect nitric oxide gas coming off the burning cigarette. And we actually did, when I was in Boston, I believe we had a grant looking at the effects of nitric oxide in cigarette smoke on cardiovascular health. So I think what we figured out was there's so many toxic things in cigarette smoke that it certainly outweighs the small benefit you may get from the little bit of nitric oxide that's found in cigarette smoke.
What about nicotine? There's this resurgence now where people are talking about nicotine being protective to the body, maybe even a little bit cardioprotective, and that the conversation, again, I have no idea about this, but you see a lot of people talking about it. They're even talking about nicotine being a nootropic. And now they're saying that the most important thing is where the nicotine source is from. Because the challenge with cigarettes is that you get the tar, you get the toxins, you get all other stuff that's there. But that for some people, nicotine could act as sort of a vasodilator. Is that true?
No, there are nicotinic receptors inside the body. So nicotine is a vasoconstrictor, right? So when we have nicotine, it constricts the blood vessels. But there are many other kind of extravascular effects of activating the nicotinic receptors and the effects of nicotine. But it makes people feel good. I mean, it's an addictive substance. That's why people smoke. That's why people dip snuff or chew tobacco. And now you've got the nicotine in the vapes that, are rampant. But again, nicotine is one of these naturally occurring substances, and we have nicotinic receptors just like we have endocannabinoid receptors. So our body's used to seeing these things and initiating some signaling aspect. But again, in the vapes, there's probably more toxic chemicals in there that outweigh the benefits of a little bit of nicotine.
What I'm seeing a lot is people using these nicotine little pouches.
Yeah.
And kind of keeping in their mouth. You're not a fan of that?
Not a fan. No, personally, I wouldn't do it. I mean, anything that chronically constricts blood vessels, to me, as a biochemist and physiologist in the biomedical sciences, I stay away from.
Let's talk about one of the most controversial topics of maybe the last 5 years, but especially right now, if I had to rank it, seed oils. Yeah. Talk to us about seed oils, your thoughts on them. Because from everything that I've seen out there, and we've had people on all sides of the spectrum that have been on this podcast, people will tell you that universities like Harvard and Tufts and the nutrition schools at a lot of our elite institutions are saying that not only are seed oils not bad for you, but they seem to have some sort of protective benefits that are out there. Then the other side, let's call it, the Maha movement, the individuals that are out there that are saying, hey, these things have been used for industrial lubricants. These things are not benign. And just because there are observational studies that are out there that show that seed oils typically are associated with better health, that doesn't mean there aren't downsides related to it, like trans fats from overuse of seed oils. Where do you fall on the spectrum of seed oils, and how would you rank it on our system?
If we had a Z on the ranking, I would rank it as Z.
You'd put it as Z. But so right now, we're going to put it at F.
It's the absolute bottom. Yeah. And again, for me, it's about what are the risks and what are the benefits?
Yeah.
And there's really no benefit of seed oils. What are the risks? I mean, we probably don't have enough time on the show to talk about the risk. But the same people who are saying, the so-called experts and nutritionists and epidemiologists who tell us that, seed oils provide some benefit are the same people who told us that cholesterol causes heart disease for the past 30, 40 years. And it's absolutely false. Cholesterol does not cause heart disease. Targeting cholesterol to mitigate or to prevent heart disease has failed. In fact, it's made people worse. Again, let's talk about what cell biology and the effect of seed oil on human health. So every cell in the human body has a phospholipid bilayer, a cell membrane. And the fluidity of that cell membrane allows for intracellular signaling. So the cell senses an extracellular environment, and then it binds to receptors, and through this, it's a 7 transmembrane receptor signaling, and then it activates intracellular signaling, turns on proteins, turns on certain genes. But if we lose that fluidity, if we don't have enough cholesterol in there, or if we have these, polyunsaturated fatty acids, these synthetic oils, it completely disrupts the fluidity, completely disrupts intracellular signaling, and we develop cellular dysfunction. And what is that? Well, insulin institutes or causes an intracellular signaling, right? We get insulin binds to insulin receptors. The inside of the cell gets the signal. GLUT4 goes to the membrane, brings in glucose, and we clear it from the circulation. But what happens when insulin doesn't transduce that signal to bring in glucose because of lack of cholesterol, because of lack of the fluidity and the signaling aspects of seed oils, we develop insulin resistance and diabetes. And the worst, the half-life of these is about 600 days. And a half-life means that in 600 days, half of the seed oils that you had incorporated in your cell membranes is gone. And in the sciences, we need at least 5 half-lives to completely clear over 99% of that. So you need 10 years. If you consume seed oil, it takes 10 years to remove that exposure from the incorporation of human cells. So they provide zero benefit. And it's not just an acute injury. This is a chronic thing. This is what leads to chronic disease. When you lose the activity of the functional unit of life, which is the cell, you get sick, you can't perform, and your health becomes compromised.
In your opinion, what's worse for you, smoking or seed oils?
Seed oils.
You think seed oils is worse than smoking?
Chronically.
Yeah,
because everything we know about cell signaling and signal transduction, from the outside sensing to inside regulation, whether it's transcriptional, translational regulation of proteins and enzyme function, I mean, it all depends on the integrity of the cell membrane and how we can transduce that signal.
Would there be any sort of test that someone could do or research institution that if somebody had been having seed oils for, the majority of their life and somebody hadn't been, what kind of biomarkers or things would they be looking at to quantify the impact of one person being healthier than the other person? Do we have anything like that right now, or we don't have anything like that?
I don't think, not to kind of convincingly tell us that this is a problem. I mean, the standard of care is you look at a standard lipid panel, cholesterol, HDL, LDL, triglycerides. I mean, those really don't tell us anything. Total cholesterol, the people who live the longest typically have cholesterol between 240 and 280 based on the Framingham data. Triglycerides are inflammatory. We have to get our triglycerides less than 150. But if you do an advanced lipid panel and look at certain lipoprotein particles, the size, the number, and the amount of oxidized particles, that tells us really how inflamed the cell is and how inflamed that person is. But you have to ask for that, because if you just go to your primary care physician and they do a blood draw, they're just going to give you a standard lipid panel, which to me doesn't provide it certainly has no prognostic value. You got to dig a little bit deeper. Yeah,
you'd probably have to ask your practitioner who would do like a full Boston Heart workup.
That's right.
That'd be in there.
Certainly these seed oils are inflammatory. So you'll see inflammatory markers, whether it's C-reactive protein. These are kind of lead to lipid peroxidation and inflammation within the cell membrane. So you may see ferritin go up, you may see uric acid go up, C-reactive protein. Those are kind of the acute phase inflammatory markers that you may see in people who are chronically consuming seed oils. And they'll probably have metabolic disease.
I'll be honest. I personally avoid seed oils. I go to restaurants that, largely are seed oil free.
Yeah.
True Food Kitchen, Sweet Greens, Parakeet. There's a bunch of places around LA and around nationally. And I also, too, I'm going to eat out with friends sometimes. I'm going to go to other places. They're going to be using seed oils.
That's right.
I'm not going to freak out about it. I'll tell you that even being in this space as an interviewer, I'm not an expert by any means, but I get to listen to different people. I still am confused about the topic because I see individuals very convincingly talk about a lot of the bigger data that shows that seed oils are not inflammatory. And then I hear from individuals like you on the podcast that are sharing your perspective. All I know is that I don't see any benefit from including seed oils in my diet. I don't feel great when I have them regularly. That's a personal thing.
No, me too.
It's related to my throat, actually. I feel like my throat gets a little bit more inflamed. I'm not noticing it anywhere else. And then lastly, what I share with people is that if you're confused about it, know this. Generally speaking, seed oils, the primary way of people consuming them is not through cooking, even though the image that we have on here is of a cooking Crisco oil. It's actually through ultra-processed foods.
Yeah.
So generally speaking, when you reduce your ultra-processed foods, you are going to be reducing your seed oil intake. And to give credit to the other side that believes that seed oils are not harmful, what they're really talking about is that seed oils, when you replace them with saturated fat, for a lot of people, that's the whole sort of side that believes that saturated fat is not great for you when it goes above 10% of your diet. And I know you would have different feelings on that. I probably would have different feelings on that. So you can reduce your seed oil intake by reducing your ultra-processed food intake.
Yeah.
And then I think on the saturated fat side, it's contextual. I think there are people that do much better on a higher saturated fat diet. And there's people like me that are not afraid of saturated fat that I actually don't do great when my saturated fat gets up there a lot. Right. I'm a hyper reabsorber of cholesterol. my ApoB tends to be really high, even when I'm just eating very healthy, just naturally, genetically, I reabsorb a lot. It's around like 180. And I do believe high ApoB over the course of a lifetime is atherogenic.
Right.
And I'm not trying to get my ApoB a lot higher. When I would have a lot of coconut oil in my diet, when I'd have a lot of sort of saturated fat in my diet, my ApoB was up in like the 250, 280 range. And even though I've gotten my Clearly scan on my heart, the AI CCTA scan, and my heart health was, great, like fantastic. I'm just not willing to bet the farm over the course of my life. And I know that it's individualized. So like
Absolutely.
all things, if you can find an incredible practitioner to help you navigate all this stuff, that's a great place to be. But at least in your thoughts and your opinion, seed oil, if we had a Z, it would be on there. So we're going to put it as an F on our tier ranking system.
No, look, you make a great point. It's individualized. And if you eat something and you don't feel great afterwards, that's your body telling you, hey, back off. And you said if people eat and they get flu-like symptoms. I mean, that would tell me, and I tell people all the time, keep a food diary. And if you're struggling with health issues, anything you put in and on your body, write it down. And then a pattern will start to develop. And then just kind of record how you feel. Then when you go back to that and you go, I felt horrible yesterday afternoon. Then you go back and say, oh, well, 90 minutes before that, I had McDonald's, Big Mac and fries, and a 48-ounce Diet Coke. I mean, you should feel better.
Well, we just talked about this, but let's talk about it again. Tell us the role of ultra-processed foods and how they impact our nitric oxide production.
Well, look, processed foods, it's a broad category.
So this is ultra-processed, but I'll let you share the whole spectrum.
So processed, even things like ground beef, ground turkey, ground chicken, it's processed.
Whey protein.
Yeah, it's all processed. But the problem is, and there's this term you hear all the time, non-perishable food items. That's an oxymoron. If it's non-perishable, it's not food, right? Food is designed to have a certain shelf life. And so if you've got food that can set on the shelf and not spoil for weeks, months, years, that's not food. And the reason it's not food is because it's ultra-processed and there's preservatives in there and things that won't allow it to rot or spoil. And I think we've all seen this. People who bought a Big Mac and fries from McDonald's that's been sitting outside for 10, 12 years, yet it still looks like a Big Mac or fries that you would go and get if you bought it immediately.
Yeah, it hasn't broken down.
It hasn't broken down. I mean, that is not food. And why is it not food? Because it's ultra-processed. So I think, again, the ultra-processed foods provide very little nutrient value. So there's no benefit. And what's the risk? The risk is all those preservatives that you're consuming are now disrupting normal cell biology. So again, in the spectrum of risk benefit, ultra-processed foods, again, I'd probably give it, probably an E or an F.
Okay. We don't have an E, but we have a D and an F.
A D. Okay, let's do a D.
All right. So we're going to give ultra-processed food a D on the system. So far, we have a D for ultra-processed food. We have smoking as an F. And we also have seed oils, which we talked about, as an F. In fact, if we could have it be a Z, you would have given it a Z. Awesome. Let's zoom out a little bit for a second. I was really interested to see that in the new book, you talked about the role of nitric oxide when it comes to fat in the body and retaining fat. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
So nitric oxide affects many different things. It turns genes on, and we've run, I was here this week at a nitric oxide scientific meeting. The top probably 140 scientists in the world come together every 2 years, and we discuss kind of the latest in nitric oxide chemistry, biology, and the clinical applications of that. But we're learning that nitric oxide can turn genes on and turn genes off by histone modification, by affecting DNA methylation. So it's really controlling the epigenetic regulation of gene expression. So there's many things that affect that. But here's what we know in terms of fat deposition. So it's the quality of the calories that we consume, and it's how we burn calories. And it's based on, the TCA Krebs cycle, glycolysis, and things like that. How do we mobilize fuel? So there's not a lot of data really on the direct effects of nitric oxide on fat metabolism. We know that through, turning yellow fat to brown fat or white fat to brown fat, it's the yellow visceral fat that's inflammatory. The brown fat is more thermogenic, and it's because it contains more mitochondria, generating more energy. So we know that things like caloric restriction, intermittent fasting, the cold plunge, the contrast therapy, all that has been known to convert the yellow fat, the visceral fat into brown fat, more thermogenic, and you basically consume more fat or burn more fat.
Are you a fan of cold plunging?
I'm not a fan of it. I do it. It's not very fun. But no, usually when I'm at home every day, I start my day in a sauna, 170 degrees for 30 minutes, and then I do a 3-minute cold plunge at 37 degrees.
Let's talk about another one that's on this list, poor sleep. What's the role of sleep? And especially, what's the role of poor, inconsistent, high-quality sleep when it comes to nitric oxide production?
We know that nitric oxide can help the body restore and replace cells during sleep. And so, aging is just wearing our cells out and the inability to repair and replace dysfunctional cells or senescent cells. And we repair and replace when we sleep. So if you're not getting good sleep, or if you have obstructive sleep apnea, or you're hypoxic when you sleep, you can't produce nitric oxide, you can't mobilize stem cells, and you don't repair and replace dysfunctional cells. So in terms of poor sleep on nitric oxide, there are many other things that are affecting nitric oxide production than poor sleep. But poor sleep will certainly lead to a loss of nitric oxide production, because if you're not fully oxygenated, if you're not mobilizing stem cells and repairing and replacing cells that can work properly, then you can't make nitric oxide. And you're chronically inflamed, you're stressed, and it's just a downward spiral.
You've covered this before, but this is a good opportunity to remind people, how is nitric oxide actually created in the body?
So today we know there's two ways that the human body makes it. One is through an enzyme called nitric oxide synthase. This enzyme is first found in our endothelial cells, the cells that line all blood vessels throughout the body. And so we call that eNOS. It's found in the neurons. We call it nNOS. It's found in our immune cells and activated macrophages. We call that inducible nitric oxide. But really, nitric oxide, the synthase, the enzyme is found in most cells, because every cell, part of that insulin signal transduction involves nitric oxide in a certain way. So when that enzyme becomes dysfunctional and it becomes what we call uncoupled, then it loses its ability to convert arginine, L-arginine, to nitric oxide. So that's number one. Number two is through the oral microbiome. So the foods we eat, and I'm sure we'll address that are enriched in nitrate, the bacteria in and on the body convert that into nitrite, nitric oxide. So that obviously is dependent upon our diet. It's dependent upon the oral microbiome, and it's dependent upon stomach acid production. Any of those steps become compromised, then we lose the ability to make nitric oxide. So one can compensate for the other. If we have poor endothelial function, if we eat a certain diet, we support the microbiome, and we have stomach acid, you can kind of compensate, if you will, for the lack of endothelial function. But if you have endothelial dysfunction, a poor diet, and that's what most Americans are faced with, we see, poor health, metabolic disease, hypertension, sexual dysfunction, cognition decline, and eventually Alzheimer's.
You mentioned the foods that support nitric oxide production and the lifestyle habits. We're going to talk about a couple, but we actually have a separate list that we're going to go through 12 things that really, really supercharge and support nitric oxide production. So stay tuned. We're going to get to that in a second. So where would we put poor sleep on our list of, A, B, C, D? I know it's not supreme. But how bad is poor sleep for you?
So just by way of clarification, we're ranking it based on overall health or overall nitric oxide production.
If A is good for you, B is, obviously we already are putting,
these may be really bad for you, but it may be completely independent of nitric oxide production.
Okay.
So there may be a disconnect there.
Okay.
Poor sleep is probably the worst thing. It would certainly be an F. But is it because it's disrupting nitric oxide production? If that were then I would have to rank it probably midway, kind of halfway in between. But certainly, poor sleep is a driver of chronic disease.
Okay, great. So we'll put that in the category of F, because it's just not good for you overall.
That's right.
And that's something that people obviously need to pay attention to. So we're just going to put it in terms of F, but you've added in the clarification of it's not necessarily the worst thing for nitric oxide production, but it's going to be one of the worst things for your overall health.
Right.
Okay, so stress. Let's talk about that and where you would put that on our list of things of where we would rank it.
Yeah, so stress is one of these subjective things that you asked, right? But for stress, for me, there's a stress response, there's stress hormones, there's overproduction of cortisol, there's overactivation of the sympathetic nervous system and dysautonomia. And so what we have to do is correct that stress response. And so, but this is, this takes a mental kind of a complete change in perspective. Everybody's stressed. We live in a stressful world, but stress doesn't solve anything. And I made a conscious decision many years ago that if I can't change it or control it, then I don't worry about it. And think about that. If you can't change the situation or control the situation, you shouldn't worry about it. That's 99% of the things that people stress over. Right? So what I do is, it's this old saying, it's not what happens to you that matters, it's how you respond to what happens to you that matters. So, I live a pretty stress-free life.
And it doesn't mean that there's not stressful things around you.
Yeah, no, there's stress. People apply a lot of stress to me. I just don't stress over it, because if I can't control it or change it, what good does it do? It's not going to change the situation. No, but what we have to do is affect there's something called adrenal fatigue, and the adrenal glands secrete these things like adrenaline, these stress hormones, and cortisol. So when you have chronic elevation of cortisol, that's a normal stress response. So we need that acutely, right? But when you're chronically stressed, and then it completely shuts down and disturbs, other hormones and the whole endocrine system. And it'll eventually shut down nitric oxide production, because you're inflamed, you develop oxidative stress, and you develop an immune dysfunction.
So part of what I'm hearing you saying is that there's this chronic stress that so many people are wrapped up in. It could be physical stress on the body from an ultra-processed diet. It could be not dealing with the toxic people in your life and putting up boundaries, other examples of that. But stress in itself, like doing a cold plunge, that's a little bit stressful. So there's good stress, there's bad stress that's there. So stress isn't the worst thing for us. We shouldn't fear it, but we should look at the areas that it's overruling our life and the root causes that are contributing to it.
Yeah, we call that hormesis in terms of how the body adapts to, because when we exercise, or when we go for a run, or when we do a cold plunge, it's an acute stress on the body. So the body then transduces an adaptive response. So like resistance training, there's intermittent hypoxia. When we contract our muscles, it's squeezing on the blood supply, and then it's causing intermittent hypoxia. So the body responds with angiogenesis. We're creating more blood vessels. So now with that same resistance, we're not developing hypoxia, because now we revascularize that tissue. We develop, we build more protein, we build more muscle, and that's the benefits of weight training. For instance, when we run, if you're doing a marathon and you're running for 2 to 3 hours, you're completely diverting blood flow away from the kidneys, the intestines, and some people can develop ischemic organ disease. But the body adapts to that and go, oh, I don't want to run out of oxygen again. I need more mitochondria, turns on mitochondrial biogenesis. It improves the oxygen utilization. So now that cell can make more energy with less oxygen. And why is that? Because it was confronted, it dealt with a stress, an acute stress. And that's kind of like the cold plunge. When I go from the sauna 170 degrees to 37 degrees, it's flexing the blood vessels, because when you're hot in a sauna, your blood vessels are maximally dilated, trying to rid the body of the heat so it doesn't overheat. Then when you go to cold, the body's trying to preserve heat, so it constricts all the blood vessels. So for me, it's like weight training for your blood vessels, because there's smooth muscle that's around all the blood vessels, and it's working them out. But it's stressful. But the adaptive effects to that acute stress are undeniable.
I would look at the system that we have, and I would take something like stress. We got a guy with, putting his hand on his head in front of a laptop. It probably could be like a B or a C, in the sense that it depends.
If it's a controlled stress, chronic stress will kill you.
Chronic stress will kill you.
Yeah.
But a controlled stress that you choose, is actually really helpful. So I'm going to throw it on here under C, as a place to say that it depends.
It can go either way.
Because really good stress for you could be an A, or maybe even an S in certain situations.
Absolutely.
Okay. A sedentary lifestyle, specifically walking less than 4,000 steps a day, which the CDC says is sedentary. How bad is that for you? Talk about both nitric oxide and anything that when it comes to keeping a healthy body composition.
Well, we have to move. Humans are designed to be mobile, to move. And yet most Americans aren't. We get in our car, we drive to work, we sit for 6, 8, 10 hours a day. Nobody gets exercise. And then the calories we consume through diet is stored as fat, and we become unhealthy. But we have to move. And kind of scientifically explaining this, because exercise has been shown to stimulate nitric oxide production. And that's why exercise is medicine. You're giving your body activation and stimulation of nitric oxide. The other thing, kind of an electrical, we're electrical beings, right? We diagnose death through loss of electrical activity, EEG or EKG. So we have to maintain electrical conductance and flow and current, and maintain voltage across cell membranes. Muscles are what we call piezoelectric, meaning that when we contract muscles, when we move muscle, they're muscle battery packs. So they're creating voltage. And through the fascia, through these meridians, those muscle battery packs supply different organs with certain voltage. So you'll find in one study, conductors who do this, orchestra conductors, they have some of the lowest rates of heart attack and cardiovascular disease than any other profession. And why is that? Because they're doing this, and this is fueling the muscle battery pack that supplies the heart. So that heart never runs out of voltage, never conductance. And if you do that all over, we have to contract our muscles and get those battery packs. So when we lose voltage, when we lose this transmembrane potential, which is about minus 25 millivolts, and if you convert that to pH, it's a pH of 7.4, right, which is normal physiological pH. When we lose that transmembrane potential and we lose the ability for that cell to maintain some sort of negative inside with respect to outside of the cell, we develop dysfunction. And when the inside of the cell becomes positive with respect to the outside, we call that cancer. And that's, the Warburg effect. So cancer only grows in a low oxygen, low pH, low voltage environment. And so when we move, when we exercise and we eat food and we ground and get electrons and we maintain some voltage and electron flow, then we become a little bit protective from, not a little bit, we become a lot protective from chronic disease.
So would you say that, across the entire spectrum of things, one of the worst things that you could do when it comes to especially nitric oxide, if you care about it, is to be sedentary?
Be sedentary and eat an ultra-processed food diet, which unfortunately is most Americans.
That's most people that are out there.
That's most people, yeah.
And again, what are your thoughts on sedentary being defined as around less than 4,000 to 3,000 steps a day? Do you consider that to be sedentary?
Look, there has to be benchmarks, right? You have to have something, kind of a milestone. I think it's not difficult at all to walk 3,000 steps a day. So if you're not getting in 3,000, then yeah, I think that's probably, if you're just walking from, the couch to the toilet, to the kitchen, to the garage, from the parking lot you should easily be able to get 3,000 steps. And if you're not doing that, then yeah, I think that would certainly be sedentary.
And I think that, if you have an iPhone, if you have any phone now, they all have pedometers. And again, there's this whole history that 10,000 steps a day was a whole marketing campaign that came from a Japanese pedometer company. But still, there's some truth to it as a benchmark that if we are not getting these amount of steps, it's just an indication that we're probably, in our modern day and age, we're sitting a lot.
That's right.
You're watching TV a lot. You're not moving. You're not really activating your lymphatic system. You're not pushing your heart enough.
No, that's right. The lymphatic system is dependent upon muscle contraction, right? Especially in the lower extremities. If you're not moving them, you're going to get lymphedema, you're going to get pooling, and you're going to get neuropathy and vascular disease, peripheral vascular disease. So that's just one aspect, but you have to have a target. You can't set goals if you don't have a target. So yeah, some of these numbers are random. Is it 3,000? Is it 10,000? It doesn't matter, but you have to have a target. You can never hit your target, hit your goal if you don't have a target. So I think it has some meaning, but what is the right number? I don't know.
We've done a few episodes on this with Mike Mutzel and a few other people. And generally they say that a good place to start is that wherever you are, if you try to get an extra 3,000 steps, that's a good place to start off with. So if you're at 3,000, just try to get an additional 3,000, shoot for 6,000, right? If you're at 4,000, try to get an additional 3,000, shoot for 7,000. And track it using your phone. That's what I was mentioning before. You don't have to get any sort of fancy device. You can keep your phone on you, put it on airplane mode, put it in your back pocket, whatever it is. If you have an Apple Watch, obviously that's tracking it as well too. And actually see what you're getting in. A lot of people think that they're moving around throughout the day. And once they actually start tracking, they're like, oh, shoot, I'm not getting in that many
No, but it's
steps.
consistency. You can't do it one day and go, oh, I did that, and then never do it again. For me, I travel every week. And so sometimes I would, when I arrive at a new hotel in a new city or new country, I always go to the gym, right? No matter what time of day it is, because I've been sedentary in an airplane for sometimes 15, 16, 18 hours. And then when I figured out, that's not always possible. So now what I do, and I've been doing this for probably 6 months, when I wake up, usually within 5 or 10 minutes, I do 100 push-ups and 100 squats every morning. And that takes me less than 5 minutes. And I don't have to go to the gym anymore. And then I did that, and at first it was pretty difficult. But now I can get it in and no problem. So what I did, I'm not content with that. Now I'm doing 200. And I'll do that. When that becomes too easy, then I'll up it. But that, for me, I do an 18-hour fast every day. I wake up every morning, do 100 push-ups. Now it's 200 push-ups, 200 squats. And it's just gets your day going. And it's mobilizing the lymph. It's removing a lot of the inflammation, the bags under the eyes, because everything's pumping. Blood's pumping, lymph is flowing, and you just feel better. There's no better way to start your day.
We wrote a newsletter. We'll put it on the screen over here and link to it in the show notes. But it was about one benchmark for, I believe that it was done on men, but one benchmark to see how well you're aging. And they studied a group of firefighters, and they found that, like, can you work your way up to getting 40 push-ups, right? And that's a great sort of proxy for grip strength as well as cardiovascular strength. And, that's a good target for people to shoot for, right? I don't know if they did the same test with women. There's plenty of other studies that will be applied to both individuals, but we can link to that in the show notes below.
No, just one short comment on firefighters. Firefighters in a general population have about the same risk of heart attack as any other profession. However, when they go into a burning building, their risk of heart attack within 24 or 48 hours after entering a burning building goes up tenfold.
That's crazy.
Because they're breathing the carbon monoxide and all these toxins and
the
pollutants.
Particles 2.5, PM 2.5.
And so they're at risk. And so we're, certainly during the fires here in LA, we donate a lot of product to them to protect them. I mean, they're protecting the community and going in when, doing their job, and it's putting them at risk. Yeah.
Shout out to all the firefighters that, kept, as crazy as these fires were here in Los Angeles where we're recording. And I think that I heard Rick Caruso say that it was, and multiple other people say that it's two Manhattans, two areas the size of Manhattan.
Crazy.
Manhattan twice that burned down, that was there. But a lot more would have burned down if it wasn't for the heroic firefighters looking out for everybody. So safe to say that if we had a Z, and might come up with a new tier ranking system after chatting with you, but at least for this ranking system that we have right now, we're going to put a sedentary lifestyle, walking less than 3,000, 4,000 steps a day. We're going to put that as an F.
Yeah. I don't think, again, there's no benefit to not doing exercise.
Yeah.
And there's enormous risk. So again, if we're using that same risk benefit quotient, it's got to be at the bottom.
Okay. What about this one? This one seems like something that a lot of people ask. I think it was one of the top comments in a previous episode. People asking, I know Nathan's thoughts about excessive amounts of sugar in the diet, right? And its role with nitric oxide, which I might have you recap here in a second after you answer the question. But what about a nightly dessert? Where does that fall on the list of things when it comes to nitric oxide and just overall health for the body?
Well, again, I think it's individualized. It depends upon your metabolic flexibility. Continuous glucose monitors are available anywhere. Anybody should do it. And I think everybody should do the experiment. So broadly speaking, nightly dessert is not good. The worst thing you want to do is eat right before bed, and especially get a spike in blood sugar and insulin before bed. You're not going to sleep well, and it's a recipe for disaster.
It's going to drive your resting heart rate up, and a resting heart rate right before bed is one of the biggest predictors of great sleep. When my resting heart rate is lower, I sleep better. When it's higher, like a big meal or dessert on occasion, I don't sleep as good.
Yeah. No, look, what you do one day a week isn't going to kill you. It's what you do the other 6 days that probably will. So an occasional nightly dessert is not great, but as long as you're not doing that every night. And again, for me personally, I speak to what I do. I try to eat my last meal before 6 p.m. And then I don't eat again until noon the next day. So it's an 18-hour fast every day. But they're not like at this conference. We eat at like 7 o'clock and there's always dessert. You're hanging around, you're networking, you're having friendly conversation. And so, I'll have a bite or two or some cake or a cookie or something that's around. Does it affect my sleep? No, because I know I'm not going to get this spike in blood sugar because my insulin is very sensitive. My body can mobilize that and bring it into the cell, and I don't get the hyperglycemic response, and I certainly don't get an increase in heart rate. But everybody's different. So what I tell people is get you a continuous glucose monitor and then figure out what you eat. Again, take a food diary and figure out how big did that lead to an increase in blood glucose, and how long did that persist?
Yeah.
And then you have to experiment with yourself. And if you're concerned about the health is our number one asset. And if you're concerned about that, don't take my word, because what I do may not work for you. You may not have the discipline to do what I do. And when somebody else does that, like the Ben Greenfields and the Dave Asprey's of the world, I don't do what they do. It works for them, but it doesn't work for me.
Yeah, a couple points that are there. I'm a huge fan of continuous glucose monitors. My listeners know I'm an advisor and investor in Levels. I love the company. I think they have the best software that's out there in the space. We'll put a little code up here and a link that people can check out. I believe it's levels.co/Dhru, but we'll put the link in the show notes as well. And then through Levels, I'm also a big fan of taking your, using that data of the continuous glucose monitoring and seeing like what times of the day do you feel like fatigue? Do you feel off? And how does that correspond with like blood sugar spikes? That was my biggest learning. Even though I was eating a whole foods diet, organic, all the stuff that was out there, I was eating carbs for me at certain times of the day and then feeling like immediately tired, like as if I ate like a big Thanksgiving dinner. Right. And it was weirdly certain types of foods. Like I love blueberries, but if I eat a ton of blueberries, I don't know what is up with my gut microbiome or whatever. And blueberries are healthy for you. Listen, I'm not saying blueberries are not healthy for you. I crash like crazy, especially if I blend them in a smoothie. Yeah. But if I blend strawberries, I'm great. I have good energy. Everything is good. Again, that's some of that individuality that's there. So I do not put blueberries in my morning smoothie anymore because I crash like crazy. I'd be falling asleep at this podcast table. That's there. And the other thing that I like through Levels is that blood sugar is great. And a lot of how sensitive you are to insulin is muscle mass. And I didn't get that memo until later in life. I got serious around the age of 39, turning 40 from talking with Dr. Gabrielle Lyon to really start investing in my muscle, which has been it's a lot of work to get 0.8 pounds of lean muscle mass added during a period of time. Like I have to like bust my ass. I'm in the gym 3 to 4 days a week, strength training, and, making sure that I'm hitting my protein goals. But I can tell you, nothing has improved my insulin sensitivity, my blood sugar, like adding. And I was pretty skinny fat before, right? I was lean, but I was still fat. My body composition was almost 24, 26% body fat. And it wasn't that I was fat. It was that I was under muscled. And when I added almost about 9 pounds of lean muscle mass, I saw a massive difference, and I actually could get away with eating even a little bit more carbohydrates. And through the Levels app, I did my blood test because they allow you to do blood testing too. You can get blood tests done. They'll send a phlebotomist, or you can go to like a local Quest or LabCorp, I forgot where, and you get your fasting insulin done. Yeah. And I saw that even though I was eating more carbohydrates, my blood sugar was more stable, and my fasting insulin even improved during that period of time. So whether you do it through Levels or whether you do it through somewhere else, just remember that testing is important. Test, don't guess. And then on top of that, invest in your muscle mass.
For sure. Now, look, it's improving your metabolic flexibility and improving insulin sensitivity, because people monitor fasting glucose levels. And glucose is bad because it sticks to proteins and renders things dysfunctional. But the inflammation that occurs from that is due to the hyperinsulinemia, the elevation of insulin for prolonged periods of time. And so if you can improve insulin sensitivity, and that's where muscle mass comes in, because there's 3 main kind of cell types that take up glucose and are insulin sensitive. It's skeletal muscle, it's the liver, the liver cells, and it's the fat tissue. So if you increase in your skeletal muscle, then you're increasing insulin sensitivity, increasing glucose uptake. And people who don't have a lot of muscle mass, then they're relying on the liver. It overburdens the liver. The fat cells, the adipose cells. And so you're working at 67% instead of 100%.
Just to clarify one thing you said glucose is bad for you. I think what you mean is that excessive amount of glucose.
Yeah, the chronic hyperglycemia.
Yeah.
And you monitor this through hemoglobin A1C. And what is that? That's sugar that's stuck to hemoglobin, the blood cell that carries oxygen to all cells in the body. But it's not unique to hemoglobin. It sticks to other proteins. It sticks to enzymes like nitric oxide synthase. And in enzymology, these proteins have to be flexible and nimble and undergo conformational change to transfer electrons. If you got too much sugar and the sugar stuck to it, it's glue, right? If you spill a soda on the countertop and you come back the next day, what is it? It's sticky. That's glue. It's glucose. It's sugar. Sucrose in that case. So it does the same thing in the body. Everything sticks together, and then you can't, red blood cells can't form. You can't deliver oxygen. Develop, coats your neurons, you develop neuropathy. It's just bad news. You have to eliminate sugar.
So we didn't rank a nightly dessert. Okay. So in this instance, I'm going to talk about a nightly dessert, literally people having dessert every night, and the classic cookies, filled with gluten and sugar, or, ice cream that's there. Where are we going to put that on our list of items that we have
certainly
over here?
At the bottom? It's probably not as bad as smoking or seed oils, but it's certainly not good. I mean, again, it's risk benefit. Are there nutrients in that? There's probably not a lot of healthy protein, probably not a healthy fats. There's a lot of carbs.
It's going to disrupt your sleep.
Going to disrupt your sleep.
So what do you think, a D?
Yeah, probably an E. Yeah, D.
Okay,
D,
great. We'll put that
yeah.
as a D. We're going to go to another one, which is going to sound a little bit out of the blue. And then we'll speed round through the rest of these so that we can get into the list of things that actually make a huge difference to benefit our nitric oxide production, including many foods that are there. But bacon for breakfast, separate from nitric oxide, right? I don't know if there is a connection that's there from nitric oxide. Well, what are your feelings about bacon for breakfast when it comes to the conversation of inflammation, visceral fat? Is it something that you have, or should people be steering away from that?
I don't eat breakfast, but I know people who do. If you're going to eat breakfast, a high protein, quality fat breakfast is the best. The worst thing you can do for breakfast is eat pancakes and, drink milk and things like that. Bacon, it's high quality protein. It's good fat. And so if you're going to break your fast, then bacon's the way to go.
Okay, you like bacon.
I like bacon.
So you're going to put bacon higher up on the list, maybe an A or a B. There's nothing wrong with it.
No, but it's probably not promoting nitric oxide.
So separate from nitric oxide.
Okay. Yeah, bacon for breakfast. I think an intermittent fast every day and not breaking your fast in the morning is kind of the best prescription. But if you're going to eat breakfast, bacon for breakfast would probably be a B.
Okay, great. We'll put it as a B. I found I don't do really well skipping breakfast. I like to have a much earlier dinner. I'll usually shoot to have dinner. Like if I could have dinner some days, like I know this can sound crazy to people, but if I can have dinner some days at like 4:30, right? 5, I feel amazing.
No, me too. That's my preference. If I could have dinner at 5 o'clock, 5:30.
But I know you like to skip breakfast. Yeah. I've found that, and again, this is where the whole personalization piece comes in. And I also will say, for a lot of the women in my life, my wife, if she skips breakfast, my sisters, and I work with my sisters, if they skip breakfast, they don't feel like they're functioning. Now, that doesn't mean that they're eating Cheerios and pancakes. No, they need a little bit of smoked salmon, avocado, olive oil, some chicken sausage, some greens, fat, fiber, protein is their typical breakfast. They just feel like they're functioning so much better. And I've talked to a few female clinicians about this on the podcast. And one of the thoughts and ideas is that especially for women in their prime fertility years, maintaining a stable sort of blood sugar is one of the things that signals to their body that like they're safe and everything is okay. So there may be some individuality. I generally see the women that tend to do better on fasting maybe are out of that period of time in their life. They might be individuals that are going through menopause, at the tail end of the perimenopause spectrum. So there is that variety. And then I think that it's easier in America to probably skip breakfast because breakfast is one of the more unhealthy meals that are there. But I've found, this is where you should really test things for yourself.
That's right.
If you need a lot of brain power in the morning, if you, don't do well with intermittent fasting, try eating and then move your window for dinner a little bit earlier and see how you do.
No, I agree, but not a high carb breakfast.
Right, not a high carb breakfast.
If you have good metabolic flexibility, the body is designed to maintain optimal blood sugar. We need glucose, we need sugar to fuel cells, especially in the brain. That's a primary energy source for the brain is glucose. If you fast, the body then starts to break down glycogen stores, primarily in the muscle, and mobilize that as glucose. So even if you're not consuming it, your body's making it through glycolysis and the breakdown of glycogen. So that's how our body maintains homeostasis. But if you're not, and you don't have a lot of glycogen stores, which a lot of people don't, you can do that through some impedance and figure out then you're going to get some low blood sugar and maybe feel lightheaded and dizziness and develop a little syncope and feel bad. Then I would recommend you probably have to eat. But again, it's the individual, it's the personalization of medicine and nutrition.
Here is one that you've talked about before. It might even be some of your most viral videos on Instagram. We talked about it previously on the podcast. Yeah. It's pretty controversial on YouTube. There's a lot of people that disagree with it, but it's the idea of using antiseptic mouthwash. Where does that fall on the list and why would you put it there when it comes to specifically nitric oxide production?
Well, I think it's probably one of the worst things you can do. And again, it's not based on opinion, it's based on data, both clinical observational data and then understanding the mechanism of what that does. And so I kind of compare it to the chronic use of antibiotics. right? No matter what physician you go to, here in the US or abroad, there was no physician in his right mind that would say, I'm going to give you an antibiotic and I want you to take this every day, sometimes twice a day, for the rest of your life. Why wouldn't they do that? Because today we know that destroying the microbiome, the bacteria that live in and on our body, causes systemic disease. The bacteria that live in and on our body outnumber human cells 10 to 1. And sure, there's some infectious pathogenic bacteria that cause disease, that cause infections. But for the most part, if we can maintain a healthy microbiome, then those bacteria kind of police the bad guys and keep them at bay. So mouthwash destroys the microbiome, shuts down nitric oxide production because it's killing these nitric oxide producing bacteria. And then what are the consequences of that? We see an increase in blood pressure, which is the number one risk factor for cardiovascular disease, number one killer of men and women worldwide. You lose the protective benefits of exercise. And that's just a short list. Develop a sexual dysfunction because if you can't make nitric oxide, can't dilate blood vessels, can't get an erection. And so that's a major problem. And all you have to do is look at the numbers. 2 out of 3 Americans use mouthwash every day, sometimes twice a day. 2 out of 3 Americans have an unsafe elevation in blood pressure. And prescription medication isn't bringing it down because there's no prescription antihypertensive medication that's targeted toward the oral microbiome. Antiseptic mouthwash, fluoride, is absolutely one of the worst things you can do for the microbiome, nitric oxide production, and overall health.
If you had to put it on a list, and we don't have it here, but you added another column called Z where you put seed oils.
No, it's certainly an F. I mean,
okay, it's definitely an F. So we're going to put seed oils
let me qualify
as
that.
an F.
So we're talking about daily chronic antiseptic use.
Yeah.
So just like if I get a scrape or something and it's infected and I have systemic infection or at risk of developing sepsis, I want an antibiotic. Don't deny me an antibiotic, right? It's effective treatment for infections. If you've got dental patients who have horrible, poor oral hygiene and really pathogenic bacterial infections that could cause them to have a heart attack or stroke or increased vascular inflammation, those patients may need an acute antiseptic kind of treatment, whether it's chlorhexidine or something to kind of eradicate, but you can't do it every day, right? Just like you can't take an antibiotic every day because of the complete destruction. So we have to, and medicine is risk management, do what's best to get out of the acute critical phase, but then you got to support the microbiome, you got to support the body, and eliminating daily chronic antiseptic use, whether it's antibiotic, fluoride, or antiseptic mouthwash, you got to get rid of it.
Yeah. And plus there's so many better alternatives that are out there using healthier toothpaste that's there. I know you're working on one. There's one I use called Fig, F-Y-G-G, Dr. Mark Brahenna. There's better mouthwashes that are out there. And also too, what is the root issue of bad breath or other things like that? It's probably going to be your gut microbiome.
I mean, why does poop stink? Why do your armpits stink? Why do some people stink? Why does your breath stink? It's bacteria. It's dysbiosis. So if you can maintain a healthy microbiome, you're not going to have bad breath. Your pits aren't going to stink. And so what we've done, and we've been working on this for probably 6 years, trying to figure out, I know in dental medicine, you have to eradicate the oral pathogens, but more importantly, we have to support the healthy microbiome. And that's why, it took me 5 or 6 years to develop a toothpaste, because what's the purpose of toothpaste? Clean the teeth, clean the biofilms on the teeth, give the body the minerals it needs to enhance mineral density of the teeth, maintain healthy gums and normal pH, but more importantly, support the oral microbiome. And how do you do that? Well, you create a toothpaste that's free of any kind of detergents, fluoride, antiseptics, but then create an environment after you brush your teeth that supports the repopulation of the healthy microbiome, improve the diversity of the microbiome, normalize the pH, and that's through our oral care products. So we're developing a nitric oxide-friendly toothpaste and a nitric oxide-friendly mouth rinse.
Yeah,
so
which you have a sample over here that we might play with in a little bit. Okay, let's pause for a second. People often ask, is there a way to sort of benchmark nitric oxide in the body? And one of the things that regularly comes up is nitric oxide strips.
Yeah.
People even on this podcast previously have talked about them, that you can get a strip and you can kind of see. I've used them, and I think I even went one time to my cardiologist in St. Louis, Michael Twyman, and they can be all over the place depending on a few things. You've actually been involved in the creation of these strips, and we're going to do one live on camera here for people who are looking at YouTube. Tell us where they're helpful and tell us where they have limitations.
I was the person who developed these strips.
Wow.
In 2009, I developed these salivary test strips and created this kind of semi-quantitative colorimetric test strips. I filed patents on them when I was a professor at UT Medical School in Houston. Years later, we abandoned the patents because this chemistry that we're capturing on this test strip is old chemistry. It's called the grease reaction.
Grease.
The grease, GRIESS.
Okay.
It was named after, I think, a chemist who developed that. It's a diazonium salt that forms that turns a pink color. So we can absorb it. We can detect it at 540 nanometers, and so it should turn pink. And it's basically an acidified sulfanilamide reaction with nitrite. Very complex chemistry, but it creates this colorimetric reaction that we can quantify. The reason that I abandoned the patents and the reason that I don't rely on them anymore is because there's false positives. So there's really no false negative. And really, at the end of the day, when people understand what we're measuring and what it means, then I think they can provide value. But people would use this test strip and think, oh, this is a nitric oxide test strip. It's not a nitric oxide test strip. Nitric oxide's a gas. Once it's produced, it's gone in less than a second. What we're measuring here is salivary nitrite and the ability of the oral microbiome to recycle nitrate from the diet into nitrite. Right? Then we swallow the nitrite in our saliva. We get nitric oxide in the stomach. And the example came years ago, probably 10 or 12 years ago. We were demoing these test strips, I think, at a compounding pharmacy in Austin. And this 50-year-old guy walked in, severe obese, morbidly obese. His blood pressure was through the roof. He was diabetic. He hadn't had an erection in 10 years. And obviously the clinical symptoms of nitric oxide deficiency, complete nitric oxide deficiency. He goes, oh, well, let me test this. He turns bright pink.
And by the way, bright pink, the more pink, the better.
The higher the nitric
oxide.
The interpretation.
That's interpretation.
So we go, oh, he goes, I'm healthy. If what you're saying is true, I'm healthy. I don't need nitric oxide. But
yeah.
This dude had all the comorbidities, all the symptoms of nitric oxide.
So what was causing it to be pink?
An oral infection.
Okay, so if somebody has dysbiosis in the mouth that's not treated, that could make this strip turn pink.
What we're measuring in that case is the immune reaction, the local immune response in the gingival tissue in the mouth from either an asymptomatic or even a symptomatic infection. He didn't even know he had an infection, but yet his immune system did, and it was creating these macrophages were producing nitric oxide. It was spilling over in the saliva, and we were detecting it on these test strips.
Should we do one of these strips and see how it is?
Yeah. So what we're measuring is kind of steady state salivary nitrite, and so this is dependent upon our diet, the last meal we had, the presence of oral microbiome, the activity of the receptors in the transport material in the duodenum, the silane receptor in the salivary glands. So it's a very complex cycle. It's called the enterosalivary circuit. If it's intact and we eat a good diet, but again, it's based on our last meal, how dilute our saliva, people with dry mouth, poor salivary secretions, they're usually always low because they don't have that circuit intact.
I think the last time I did mine, it was low, and I did it at my cardiologist's office. But then also, they have another machine that they use as a proxy for seeing how well you do with nitric oxide.
That's right.
It's
the functional tests
yeah,
are much, but this is a biochemical test.
Right. And I scored pretty high on that one.
Yeah.
But let's see. So what are we doing with this?
So typically what I do is just
get some saliva in your mouth.
Get some saliva and just apply it on the end of the test strip.
What's the end of the strip? Is it this side?
So this is you'll see the pad there, the test pad.
Okay. I licked the wrong side, so that shows what I know. Okay. So
I haven't eaten since 5:30 p.m. yesterday.
All right. Mine is like super light.
Yeah. So mine, I'm optimal, but I work at this, right? I know that my circuit's intact.
Yeah.
And I got up this morning, I had 1.5 cups of coffee. I did my 200 push-ups, 200 setups. I activated, stimulated nitric oxide production. I have the right oral microbiome. And this is typical for me.
Right. So again, you've talked about the limitations. Generally speaking, for most people, would you say that these strips are something that they can use or not use? Like, should they seek them out or should they not seek them out?
I think they have utility. I think they can be useful. But what I want and my goal, and really going back to the book, writing the book, is people need to understand what they're doing and what meaning that has. Same with these test strips. So I tell people it's a good tool to have in your toolbox. But like Dr. Twyman, who's a good friend and a great cardiologist, he doesn't rely on this.
Yeah.
He complements functional endothelial test, FMD, flow-mediated dilatation, which looks at the functional production of nitric oxide in the lining of the blood vessels, and then correlates it with a biochemical test. Then you really get a complete clinical picture.
Right.
So the answer is they can have utility. And we may bring them back because really what we're measuring is how well is your oral microbiome. And if you have a good diet and a good oral microbiome, then we can move the needle on these test strips, right? And that gives people something good because people want to see changes. A lot of times you don't feel the effects of nitric oxide, but you can certainly see it on these test strips, in your fasting sugar, in your fasting insulin, in your blood pressure, in your sexual function. But people, it's a nice show and tell.
For sure. Nice show and tell, has some limitations.
That's right.
Ultimately, you want to make sure you're doing all the right things that are there. We're going to be talking about some of them. And eating the right foods. We're going to be talking about some of them. Did you want to do anything else with these test strips?
Well, I just show what we're doing. And the reason this is so important, and we may bring them back, is because the effects of toothpaste, daily oral hygienic practices have such a profound impact on the microbiome and nitric oxide production. But with this mouth rinse, we've recapitulated the effects of a healthy salivary pH environment. And so in these mouth rinses, we can actually, if you use it, I'm not a big fan of mouth rinse. Maybe I'll use my mouth rinse, but I don't need to. As I've shown you, I can do what I'm doing now, maintain healthy microbiome. I haven't had a cavity since I was 5 years old. I brush twice a day. I don't floss, but I eat a healthy diet and take care of myself. So there's really no need for me to take my own mouth rinse. Well, maybe not.
Yeah.
But people who want to take a mouthwash and who want a fresh breath, they don't have a fresh breath otherwise, then this becomes extremely important.
That could be helpful.
It could be very helpful.
Where can people go to stay tuned if they want to keep in touch with when your products are out? Where should they go?
N101.com. That's the letter N, the number one, the letter O, number one.com.
So that's where they'll find the future.
Yeah.
You have like a mailing list that people can subscribe to if they want to hear about the mouthwash once it's ready?
Yeah, so we'll launch it. We're going to launch it probably the third week of March, maybe the end of March.
Great.
The toothpaste, the mouth rinse is probably maybe in April. But this Cardio Smile, maybe Breath of Life, we call this Breath of Life because it's producing nitric oxide gas. But you can do a demo. So we saw that you didn't really light it, the test strip there, but we can use this mouth rinse.
Sure.
And we'll just do a little demo here.
I'm just squeezing a little bit in.
And swish it.
So grabbing a new test strip.
And now test strip. So obviously we've diluted the saliva a little bit, right? So maybe give it a couple seconds, but mine didn't. Mine was already pretty optimal. But what we're finding is that if what we've done with this mouth rinse, we can now start to see a complete change in the microbiome.
Yeah.
And what we're finding is
kind of the same.
The same? Yeah. So again, this takes time, right? Because the turnover of these bacteria
and most helpful for people who might be dealing with something in their No,
that's right, because the target for me was
dysbiosis.
In dental medicine, we need to still address the pathogens. The pathogens may be causing systemic disease. The oral pathogens causing systemic disease. We still need to address those. So how do we selectively kill the pathogens? But how do we restore and improve the diversity of the non-pathogenic commensal oral bacteria? That's been the target, and that's what we've accomplished with this toothpaste and with the mouth rinse.
That's exciting.
So, yeah.
All right. Well, I'm going to stay tuned. And again, these are a proxy for nitric oxide. Ultimately, the thing that is the best that we have out there would be these functional tests.
That's right.
There's one called Oncoblot, right? That's. Do you know about that one? That's
the ones that I know that are probably the best clinically validated is a device called the Endopat.
Endopat,
yeah.
Oncoblot. I got confused. Oncoblot was an old test that was an early cancer detection test that was taken off the market for a while. Whole story around that. But Endopat, yes.
Endopat. So, and then there's others. There's a CV profiler. There's the Max Pulse. All these, but they're all doing different things. The Endopat is what we're looking. It's called flow mediated dilatation, and it's venous occlusion plethysmography is kind of the technique. But what that device does is, if you've done it, they put a blood pressure cuff on your brachial artery.
Yep.
And then they pump it up to suprasystolic levels to where it's completely impeding blood flow.
Yeah, your arm gets so sleepy.
Yeah, so for 5 minutes. So your fingers will tingle because there's no blood flow.
Yeah.
For 5 minutes. And then they release the cuff, and now you're getting this oxygen-starved tissue. It's now getting blood flow. The body's natural response is reactive hyperemia. So the hypoxic, the low oxygen environment, when the body starts to, when you release the cuff, if you have good endothelial function and the endothelial cells can make nitric oxide, it immediately dilates the blood vessels. It immediately produces nitric oxide and immediately dilates the blood vessels. So in the Endopat, I believe they're looking at change in temperature of the fingertip, which is correlated to how fast the blood supply returns to that ischemic tissue.
And the faster the blood supply returns, it's an indication that you have
better
great
nitric oxide.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I scored good. And my brother-in-law, who literally works out probably like 4 or 5 days a week, super fit. He's also a cardiologist. He scored excellent on the test.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's the functional production of nitric oxide, because nitric oxide is produced, it's gone in less than a second. It signals, it dilates, it relaxes the smooth muscle, dilates the blood vessels. And that's the only way you can detect it. What we're doing here is kind of understanding the circuitry and the oxidative end products of nitric oxide and how the body handles it. But then there's other machines that are non-ischemic or non-occlusive that's looking at the elasticity of the blood vessels or the compliance of the blood vessels. So with each beat of the heart, the aorta is very important because it dampens that pulse response. And the ability of the endothelial cells to produce nitric oxide to dampen that heartbeat and that pulse response predicts vascular health. Because if you have stiff arteries, with each beat of the heart, that pulse wave travels really fast down the vascular tree. Then when it hits kind of the bifurcation at your renal arteries, that wave reflects. Now you've got a reflective wave going on that new heartbeat, and there's an overlap, and you can look at the waveform on that. And so that's the beauty of things like the CV profile or the max pulse, because it's looking at the structure of the blood vessels.
If somebody's listening today and they're like, well, I want to find a practitioner that does these tests, where do they go?
Look, there's not enough clinicians. I mean, the really good, innovative physicians, cardiologists like Dr. Twyman, Mark Houston, the ones that are kind of on the cutting edge of diagnostics and clinical care, you got to find them. But and the beauty of this podcast is if patients go to their doctor and demand this and they start asking enough, then they'll almost be forced to bring it in the clinic. And there's no reason they should, because whether it's a cash practice or an insurance-based practice, there's ICD-10 codes for these diagnostics.
Yeah, but they got to get trained on the interpretation of the report. And that's where there's a big gap that's there.
The
that's
data is the data is only good if you know what to do with it and how to interpret it.
All right, a few more things on the tier rank system, and then we're going to go through a list of foods that can supercharge your nitric oxide production. So let's talk about one of the ones you write about in your book, lack of sunlight exposure. What's the relationship of lack of sunlight exposure to nitric oxide?
Well, sunlight is beneficial in many ways. Part of it is due to the release or activation of nitric oxide. So there's certain wavelengths of the sun, both infrared and both ultraviolet, so kind of both ends of the visible light spectrum. So infrared light coming from the sun, or infrared light technology, provides a frequency and a vibration that can release nitric oxide bound to metals. So when nitric oxide is produced in the body, it's a gas, and it has an affinity for metals, and then it binds to that metal. And sometimes it can be released. If we expose to certain frequencies like infrared light, it'll release that nitric oxide, and that becomes vasoactive. It can dilate blood vessels. The ultraviolet can actually bind. That energy is much higher, so it can cleave a nitric oxide molecule bound to a thiol, what we call a nitrosothiol. It's a much stronger bond, covalent bond. You need higher energy to release that. But, as we know, it activates vitamin D, the active form of vitamin D. Worse than lack of sunlight is sunscreen, because you got the toxic chemicals in the sunscreen that's completely preventing
traditional sunscreens. I stay away from it. My kids, none of us wear sunscreen. Very dangerous. Yeah, be sun smart. Don't overexpose at the wrong time of day, etc. Right. But the sun can be medicine for you when you use it the right way.
Look, it lowers blood pressure. If you look at just epidemiological data, people who live in kind of Scandinavia and northern kind of countries or societies have higher blood pressure on average than people who live near the equator. And there are a lot of confounding factors on that, but a predominant hypothesis or theory is that it's because there's less sunlight. And we know through the mechanism of nitric oxide production, we can produce nitric oxide, we can dilate blood vessels and normalize blood pressure.
So if we had sunscreen on the screen, you'd probably put that as an F.
Yeah, Z. It's down there with cetyls. There's no benefit. And it's very toxic.
Traditional sunscreen. And if you had sunlight exposure, how high are you going to rank that? Is that get an S? I don't know if we put anything in S yet. S is supreme. Yeah. Or does that get an A?
No, I think it gets an A. Again, because it's moderate and it's dependent upon skin type.
Yeah.
Kind of the white, kind of the typical Irish American, that has really light skin, light complexion, compared to, a person who makes a lot of melatonin, African Americans, dark skin. The requirements are completely, it's different. So again, it's the personalization of diet and lifestyle.
What about morning sunlight? Getting those first 20 minutes of the day, 30 minutes a day, getting some sunlight.
Now that ranks up there. That's pretty high because...
Would you put that as an S?
Well, it depends upon endogenous systems in the person that's exposed to that light.
Yeah.
Right. But certainly it's the most cost-effective and effective thing you can do if you want to do one thing, because it has multiple benefits. Number one, you're getting that 20, 30 minutes of sunlight, and that first sunlight a day completely resets your circadian rhythm, right? Because it's that first saying it's daylight, it's time to wake up. We've had our eyes closed all night, we've been in darkness, now we're waking up, and it completely sets our circadian rhythm.
In the book, you have a list of 12 things that we've touched on some of these already, but you have a list of 12 things that are important if you want to support your nitric oxide production. And one of the first things you talk about in the book is eating nitrate-rich foods. Why is that important?
Because it's fueling at least one of the major pathways how the body produces nitric oxide, right? So nitrate is found primarily in green leafy vegetables. Then when we consume it, about 90 minutes after we consume that food or that nitrate-rich vegetable, it's concentrated in our salivary glands. Now we're secreting nitrate with the saliva. We have the right bacteria. It's reducing this. It's doing a 2-electron reduction of nitrate to nitrite. Now our saliva is enriched in nitrite, which we can detect with the test strips. And then we swallow our saliva. And that nitrite becomes nitric oxide gas in the lumen of the stomach as long as there's stomach acid production. But if we're taking antacids, proton pump inhibitors, and there's no stomach acid secretion, we disrupt that entire cycle. And that's the other problem. We may detect nitric oxide in the saliva, but if we're taking an antacid, you're not going to get the nitric oxide that's produced in the lumen of the stomach.
Yeah, in fact, that was one of the recommendations you talked about on the last podcast, is that figuring out a way to get off of these stomach acid suppressants, right? Which would be down there on Z with seed oils.
Yeah, maybe even worse. Because they're causing death. The proton pump inhibitors are causing a 40% higher incidence of heart attack, stroke, and Alzheimer's. This is very clear, indisputable clinical observational data, because they're shutting down nitric oxide production. It's leading to an elevation of asymmetric dimethyl L-arginine, which is then inhibiting the enzyme in the lining of the blood vessel from producing nitric oxide. So this one class of drug shuts down both pathways to produce nitric oxide in the body. And what do we see? Heart attack, stroke, and Alzheimer's.
Right. And we should mention that if you've been on it for a while, you might need to work with somebody who can gradually take you off.
No, these are similar to SSRIs, and you can't just stop these drugs cold turkey because there's clinical consequences to that. You'll get an overproduction and secretion of stomach acid, and life will be
And then
miserable.
your doctor will say, see, I told you these were
you're
working.
dependent upon these, yeah.
Yeah.
Now, so what again, work with your prescribing physician, but the best kind of recipe I found is whatever dose you're taking, cut it in half. And now for 10 days, take that half dose. And then after 10 days, take that half dose every other day. And then do that for 10 days. So we're slowly titrating down the circulating levels of these PPIs. And then once you get those 20 days, then you can stop. But then because you need stomach acid to absorb things like B vitamins, iron, zinc, iodine, things you need to make stomach acid on your own, you have to supplement that because your body hasn't been able to absorb that. I tell people, take apple cider vinegar before a meal. So now you're acidifying the lumen of the stomach. So now you can actually break down the foods you're eating so you don't get reflux. And you got to figure out what nutrients you're missing. If you've been on antacids, if you do a micronutrient analysis test, blood test, you're going to find that you're depleted in B vitamins, selenium, chromium, iron. You may be anemic. You don't have any iodine. Because all this requires stomach acid production to be absorbed.
One of the other ones that we already talked about was avoiding mouthwash, right?
Yep.
Another one you list inside of your book is engaging in regular physical exercise. And we already talked about that, about how important that is. But let's double click on some of the things related to the foods that are there, right? So you mentioned a few already. You talked about beets, certain root vegetables, green leafy vegetables like spinach, arugula, kale. What do you think about people who are on a carnivore diet? Are they missing out on optimized nitric oxide production potentially? That's
a great question, a question we've been trying to answer, but no, it doesn't appear to be. And here's the thing, when we list things like beets, and there are hundreds of beet products on the market now, which typically aren't providing nitric oxide. But the problem with root vegetables, the problem with green leafy vegetables is the oxalates and the oxalic acid. So some people that are prone to developing kidney stones, may not be able to tolerate things like this. But here's the deal with the straight carnivore diet is that you're not getting the inflammation from the high carbs and you're not getting the sugar. So what we're doing is we're maintaining optimal endothelial function. That enzyme is functional. So now we can make nitric oxide on demand in the lining of the blood vessel, and we're less dependent upon the oral microbiome and feeding this pathway through the diet. Because I think most carnivores, if you've made a conscious decision to eat a carnivore-based diet, at least in my interaction with the people I've met, these people are very health conscious. They're working out every day.
They're getting sunlight.
They're drinking good, clean water, and they're doing everything else. So they can get away with that, of elimination of the nitrate. But here's the other thing. If you're making nitric oxide in the body, in the lining of the blood vessels, that nitric oxide is immediately oxidized to nitrate. So now we have nitrate, an elevation of nitrate circulating in the blood, and it's taken up in the saliva, and we're still secreting nitrate, but the nitrate is not coming from the foods we eat. It's coming from the oxidation of nitric oxide that was produced in the lining of the blood vessel.
One of the ones on the list of 12, and again, people can check out the book, The Secret of Nitric Oxide. We have a link in the show notes, Bringing the Science to Life. It's a culmination of all your work in the space, also the history of the nitric oxide molecule, how it was identified, the work in the space of, that led to the Nobel Prize on identifying it, the development of Viagra, which has shown benefits for even things like Alzheimer's disease, potentially to actually help with avoiding Alzheimer's disease in the future, cognitive decline, a whole bunch of things. So it's a fascinating read. One of the ones that we didn't talk about that is listed inside of there was the idea of hydrating well. What's the role of hydrating well when it comes to NO levels?
Well, look, the body is 80% water, and the water hydrates cells. It allows for the transport of minerals and oxygen and nutrients. And if we're dehydrated, we become dehydrated at the cellular level, right? And so then we get a buildup of toxins. And so now you've got a lower volume and a higher concentration of toxins. It becomes toxic to the cell. And hydration and urination is part of detoxification. Right, so we drink water, we have an exchange of solutes, and we urinate it out. If we're dehydrated, obviously we make less urine because the body's trying to preserve what volume it has. So then we get a buildup of toxins. But the problem is, municipal water supply, which is toxic, you're hydrating, but you're actually poisoning yourself too. And that's why I recommend good, clean water, good, well-designed home filtration system. Remove the fluorine, fluoride, the chlorine, the chloramines, the drug metabolites that's found in municipal water. But it's just a good way to detoxify, to dehydrate the cell, or to hydrate the cell, and to maintain good health. I
want to come back to this list, but first, you have another list of about 12 things in the book that harm.
I didn't realize I was focused on 12.
Well, it's also our team that put it together, but it's equally 12 on both sides. Okay. Things that harm nitric oxide production. Now, we've already talked about a lot of these things, but I'm going to pull a few that we haven't talked about. We did talk about, avoiding antiseptic mouthwash. You went into a whole aspect of that. We talked about chronic stress, lack of physical activity, smoking, the dangers of smoking when it comes to that, excessive alcohol production. What about things like chronic use of certain drugs like ibuprofen?
Well, these are a class of drugs called NSAIDs, or non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. You can get them over the counter. And all we have to do is look at the history and the use of these. And the number 3 killer of men and women worldwide is medication. Prescription medication, over-the-counter medication. NSAIDs cause gastric bleeds, they cause gastric ulcers, things like acetaminophen, which is Tylenol, can cause liver failure, liver disease, and death from liver failure. So they're very effective anti-inflammatory drugs. But what they're doing is they're masking the symptoms of inflammation without getting to the root cause of the inflammation. Same thing that steroids do, right? They kind of suppress the inflammatory response and alleviate pain. But what they don't do is address the root cause of the inflammation. So if your diet is inflammatory, if your lifestyle is inflammatory, if you have infections that are inflammatory, the worst thing you should do is just take an anti-inflammatory drug. Get to the root cause of it, because that inflammation is still there. You just don't feel it. And so again, it's risk benefit. Certainly, they can provide benefit on alleviating pain in chronically inflamed patients, but the risk, there's also risk there. There's nothing that's without risk. And so you just have to, again, it's personalized.
All right, this is a big one. And as we wind down, an important one for people to pay attention to: high blood sugar and diabetes. Almost 85% of the population, 88% of the population is in the diabetic or pre-diabetic range. And the scary thing is that many people that are in the pre-diabetic range have no idea. Their doctor hasn't even told them yet that they are on their way to developing diabetes. Why is insulin resistance and high blood sugar impairing nitric oxide signaling?
It's the number one driver of chronic disease, and it's the number one thing that completely shuts down nitric oxide production. It is the number one enemy. And it's a national security crisis, right? Because we don't even have enough healthy young kids these days to serve in the military. They can't even pass a physical. So this is a national security issue. Years ago, 30 years ago, we knew that once you develop diabetes, get what's called advanced glycosylation end products, or AGEs, and that's sugar that's stuck to enzymes, hemoglobin, other proteins like the nitric oxide synthase enzyme, completely shuts down nitric oxide production. And that explained why diabetics have higher blood pressure, they have diabetic retinopathy, they have diabetic neuropathy, and everything that in erectile dysfunction, everything about diabetes shuts down nitric oxide production, explained everything about the clinical presentation of diabetes. Then the other thing is we're learning now that once you get, that if you lose the ability to produce nitric oxide from poor diet, from sedentary lifestyle, that leads to insulin resistance. Because as I mentioned earlier, when insulin binds to the insulin receptor, it activates intracellular signaling called AKT, PI3 kinase, and AMP kinase, which is the target of metformin, glucophage, the main anti-diabetic drug. And those two proteins, or what we call kinases, activate the nitric oxide synthase enzyme. But in diabetics, we know that that enzyme isn't functional. And so it's a loss of signaling. It's resistant to insulin. We call that insulin resistance because the cell can't make nitric oxide to bring glucose into the cell. So now, if you develop insulin resistance, you got a feed-forward mechanism that's decreasing nitric oxide production, which is then decreasing insulin signaling. Now you get hyperglycemia, hyperinsulinemia, and it's just fueling this diabetes. And it's uncontrolled. And now you see even type 1 early onset diabetes that now become insulin resistant to their own insulin that they're having to take. This is a huge problem, but it's the number one driver. And so we have to get to the root cause of this. We have to give nitric oxide. If your body can't make it, then we got to get it. And that's what I've spent 25 years doing. Now we can improve insulin signaling, glucose uptake, restore endothelial function, and then you see, along with changing their diet and their lifestyle and the things that made them diabetic in the first place, we can correct that. Because we know diabetes is reversible, it's curable, it's treatable, and it's preventable.
Type 2 diabetes.
Type 2 diabetes. So once you understand the mechanism of how insulin is secreted and insulin signals and glucose is taken up into the cell and we clear it from the circulation, then you can start to take steps to address that. And the other thing is Alzheimer's. It's diabetes type 3. And it's going to increase sixfold in the next 10 to 15 years. And what is Alzheimer's? It's insulin resistance. Again, the brain uses glucose, so you can't get glucose into the cell. Those cells don't function. You get misfolding of proteins. There's focal ischemia, so loss of regulation of blood flow to the brain. You get neuroinflammation, you get oxidative stress, and you get immune dysfunction. That's Alzheimer's. What does nitric oxide do? It perfuses the brain, gets insulin in the cell, inhibits the inflammation, mitigates the oxidative stress, and prevents the immune dysfunction. So you don't get protein misfolding. I mean, it's the root cause. I mean, and again, that's the purpose of writing this book. So consumers and physicians and patients can begin to understand that maybe this one molecule, it's not a panacea, it's not a silver bullet, but understand your own health challenges. Consider nitric oxide may be the cause, the lack of it may be the cause of your health problems, but more importantly, it may be part of the solution. And so just employing these things that we talk about today of diet, lifestyle, eliminating things that are inhibiting nitric oxide production and focus on the restoration of this molecule, and your life is going to transform. I mean, I've been doing this for 20 years and I get emails, text every day when I wake up, hundreds of we've changed people's lives. There's nothing more gratifying than that.
Powerful. Yeah, nothing more gratifying than that. And a great reminder that the foundation can and should be these lifestyle factors, healthy diet, getting away from ultra processed foods, not having a sedentary lifestyle, getting that morning sunlight, maintaining some degree of caloric restriction, whether it's through intermittent fasting or
just reduce how much you're eating in a day.
Or reduce how much you're eating.
2,000 calories, then do a 1,500.
Double down on your muscle mass that are there. All these things are going to improve your body, but they're also going to increase your nitric oxide production as well. And then for some people that are on the place where they're dealing with deeper issues that might be there, oral microbiome stuff, you have some products that are on the way. And you also have, believe you mentioned it last time too, you have some nitric oxide lozenges. Is that through the same company?
Yeah, all of our products are going to be the N101. It's our consumer product division of our drug company, Bryan Therapeutics. So my objective is to create safe and effective nitric oxide product technologies in every major market segment around the world. We've done it in supplements, our orally disintegrating tablet. We make a fermented beet powder for pre-workout and energy. We've got a skincare line of products for skin and fine lines and wrinkles. Oral care, we've got a toothpaste and mouth rinse coming out, which I think is going to be a game changer. Because 50% of the people who have high blood pressure don't respond to prescription medication. And it's resistant hypertension. And the reason they're resistant to drug therapy is because it's not affecting the hypertension is a symptom of oral dysbiosis. So what we're finding is if people change out their toothpaste to our toothpaste and then start using our mouth rinse, we can improve the oral microbiome and we watch their blood pressure come down simply by targeting the oral microbiome. And now, for the first time in the history of Western medicine, we can talk about how do we get people off medication. That's never happened before.
This has been fantastic. It's always a pleasure to have you on the podcast to talk about the power of nitric oxide, the top things, which many of them we ranked on our tier ranking system that hurt it, and also the things that are helpful for it. And I think that if people walk away from this episode on, one thing is that the body is so miraculously designed. And it wants to keep you healthy. You just need to do the things that allow it to be in that state.
Like
and we covered many of them.
Yeah. No, the body's smarter than we are. We just got to get out of the way, give the body what it needs, and let the body do its job. And I think that's the direction we need to take.
We have the link to the book in the show notes, The Secret of Nitric Oxide. So you can find it where books are sold. People can pick it up. And also, if they want to keep in touch with you personally, where do they head to?
My objective is to educate and inform. And I developed a YouTube channel, Dr. Nathan S. Bryan, Nitric Oxide. I'm on LinkedIn, Instagram, Dr. Nathan S. Bryan. Yeah, nathansbook.com. This will officially launch February 24th.
Oh, beautiful.
It's where books are sold. Amazon, Barnes & Noble, 1,000 private booksellers around the U.S. And then for those interested in the products, if your body can't make it, then we do it for you. And we got products that actually produce nitric oxide. In fact, I coined a term and trademarked nutraceuticals to differentiate what we do from all the other nitric oxide products out there. And those are at n101.com.
Exciting. Dr. Nathan Bryan, thank you again for coming back on the podcast.
Thank you, Dhru.
Hey, YouTube, if you enjoyed what you just saw, keep watching for more great content on how to improve your brain and your life.
More often than not, you're getting diagnosed with your first symptom of Alzheimer's disease around 65 years old. And the first sign is episodic memory. That is the first thing that starts to go. That short-term memory, that's the first thing to go.